I'm going to knock out all the technical bits. What I'm not going to do is I'm not going to talk about the origins of bourgeois economics. I'm not going to talk about Smith and Ricardo. This is why Colin Barker hasn't come. Because I think that's a different talk. What I want to do is to look at why bourgeois economics today is in a state of acute disarray verging on crisis. I mean, crisis is a little bit strong, you see, because they don't really recognise that it's a crisis. These people have the most amazing capacity for self-delusion, you see. You have an economics profession, nevertheless, which is, if you look at the situation today compared with the period when I had the misfortune to study economics at university. I suppose it wasn't a misfortune, it got me a job, you know, but nevertheless, when I had to put up with all this sort of stuff at Bourgeois University back in the early 1970s, you then, at that period in time, had what seemed to be a coherent set of beliefs. You know, there were no, you know, the arguments were all about technical things or whatever. There was, you know, someone like Milton Friedman, the great, you know, the sort of like, not great, but the very influential, shall we say, monetarist thinker in the United States, already by that time actually very influential in the United States. There was in Britain, what you had was the overwhelming dominance of Keynesian ideas, and in terms of the textbooks, the very overwhelming dominance of something which is called the neoclassical synthesis. I'll explain what that means in a minute. Whatever. However, this was just before bourgeois economics rather exposed itself with its complete and utter inability to predict what actually happened in the early 1970s and especially in 1974. Let me just give you a quote, which is quite a revealing quote. It's from 1970, and it's from Paul Samuelson, who was, still is I suppose actually, I'll read you out his bibliography. This, Paul Samuelson, Professor of Economics at MIT, the most prestigious American university as far as economics study, Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Author of the most widely used textbook in economics, I'm sure many people have seen it, made a lot of money. Also author, alternating with Milton Friedman, of a bi-weekly column in Newsweek, advisor to some large institutional investors by his own account, offered the chairmanship of the US President's Council of Economic Advisors, but he obviously had more sense than to accept that, winner of the Nobel Prize for Economics. This man, this highly distinguished economist, announced in 1970 that the National Bureau of Economic Research, which he was talking to, has worked itself out of one of its first jobs, namely business cycles. Now, this was in 1970. The general actual sort of like record of economists at that time was quite remarkable. The most elaborate economic models which you can find, I mean, anybody who's sort of like looked at bourgeois economics will no doubt find it extremely intimidating. Anybody who's been a student, anybody who's a student now, I'm sure must find it extremely intimidating to try and deal with what has become the most elaborate array of often highly mathematical models of such sophistication that you think, my God, they really must have got something here, yeah? The trouble is, it's sort of like all these things. It's you can create the most elaborate models. If the assumptions on which you base those models are faulty, then the model itself is useless. It's sort of like same with computers. If you feed in bullshit, all that eventually is going to come out the other end is bullshit. The sophistication of the computer in itself makes absolutely no difference to the result if what you're feeding into it is absolute rubbish. Now, this is actually what's characteristic of all those incredibly elaborate forecasting models, highly expensive operations, business schools, forecasting institutions thrown up in the 50s and 60s, the enormous numbers of economists actually employed by the government, because what you actually saw in the period, particularly following Keynes really set the pattern for this, was the absorption of the economics profession into the state. Very clear in Britain and very, very clear in the United States of America. They put themselves in the hock. I mean, the interesting thing is, of course, that, you know, you have the Tory economists and the Labour economists. You know, and the Tory economists are in, basically, when the, you know, Tory governments are in, and then the Labour government comes in, and all the Tory economists go back to the universities, and a whole load of Labour economists come in. And it's, you know, the sort of cycle of these things. So they actually have a vested interest, these people, in developing sort of like ideas to back their particular political party. I mean, nothing actually wrong, I think, in actually using economics for political purposes by any means. It's just that, of course, their politics is a bit dodgy. This, of course, is never apparent in the textbooks. The textbooks, you know, start with what seems to be the most absurd set of assumptions. Once you actually start to examine them at all closely. I mean, I do actually have the misfortune to have to teach A-level economics for a living. I prostitute myself to the state, and so by the economists, I don't get anywhere near as much money for it as some people do. And I, you know, anyway, what you have to do, even today actually, you have to teach something which involves a combination of what's still called micro and macro economics. Now, I'll just say a little bit about each of those. This is the neoclassical synthesis, actually. It's a synthesis of microeconomics and macroeconomics. The micro really goes right back to the marginalist school, which developed in the 1870s and 1880s, especially in Britain, and was actually in response to Marxism. Very clear cut on the continent, this, actually, the way in which you've got a conscious response to the arguments that emerged out of Marxism and other socialist thinkers or whatever, development of people who actually wanted an alternative theory designed to justify capitalism, and therefore completely abandoned many of the great insights that earlier bourgeois economists, the great bourgeois economists like Smith and Ricardo, had developed. Marginalist economics suffers from a number of essential flaws, and I'll just talk about very briefly, very quickly, about some of the assumptions on which it rests. One is that it is individualistic, chronically individualistic. There is really no difference for them between Robinson Crusoe on his desert island having to make a choice between how he spends his time, you know, does he spend his time digging the garden or going fishing or whatever, and, you know, the worker in modern society deciding, well, should he go and work for this company or that company or whatever. There is no difference in principle, or the consumer making a choice about this, that and the other. Chronically individualistic. Rampant. Together with that we get rampant subjectivism, psychologism. At the root of all the stuff about theories of demand and so forth, I mean, there is, it's often said that, you know, Marxists don't have a theory of demand. It's not true. Marx has a very elaborate theory of, you know, how supply and demand operates. He argues, however, that you have to explain, as it were, the forces of supply and demand in the market on the basis of terms of the underlying relations of production in society, in terms of the class divisions within society. Marxist economics doesn't do that. It talks about the subjective marginal preferences, blah, 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 blah. All right? Rampant subjectivism, psychologism. Naturalism. Naturalism means a complete inability to distinguish between different sorts of societies. You know, again, you know, you look at their textbook, apart from the fact that these days they tend to talk about, well, there's the state system and the market system, and there's the mixed economy which mixes them all up somehow, you know. Really we have no real conception of there being different sorts of societies. The economic problem, as they talk about it, is the same for all societies. It arises out of scarcity of resources. There's always been scarcity, there will always be scarcity, therefore economics is true and valid for all societies, has always been, even though it didn't exist, you know, up until 100 years ago, which itself really raises a problem, and will always be. And even some Marxists actually have fallen into that trap. Assumptions about perfect competition, which are, in many ways, I suppose, the most obvious, the ludicrous things for people who go into bourgeois economics, you know, this notion that we have a world in which there are all these millions and millions of small firms compete with each other, and every so often you might get a monopoly. You know, ludicrous notions, though that in itself isn't quite so serious a problem in some ways, as the inconsistency on which that theory rests, actually. I mean, the funny thing is about these things, the resistance of the textbooks. It's like that. I mean, there's a man called Stratford, I don't want to say very much about him, but he's been very influential amongst, unfortunately influential in many ways, in certain circles. who way back in 1926 wrote an article in the Economic Journal, which was edited by Keynes, which basically showed that the whole notion of perfect competition rested on a very simple assumption. The whole elaborate models you find in textbooks rest on a very simple assumption, and that is that you have what they call a rising marginal cost curve. Now, I don't want to get it's technicalities. It rests on the notion, really, that you have diminishing returns to production. What's diminishing returns mean? It means that as you increase production, it's more and more difficult to sustain the productivity of labour. Now, this, however, is combined in neoclassical economics with a notion of, well, you get economies of scale and so forth. The trouble is, as soon as you get economies of scale, increasing returns to scale, in other words, the bigger you get, the more machinery you use, the more productive labour becomes, a fairly obvious notion you might think, then the whole assumptions on which the great elaborate models of perfect competition are constructed fall apart. Because if the more, basically if it's advantageous to get bigger and bigger and bigger, then competition tends to undermine itself. In other words, competition leads inevitably to the elimination of some of the competitors, because the bigger you get, the more, basically the more productive you can cheapen your costs, you gobble up the little people, the big fish eat up the little fish, the big sharks eat up the big fish, and so forth. Fairly obvious notion. Alright, anyway, that's all that. That's the micro side. The macro side is actually in some ways harder, I think, for people to deal with, because when you look at it, you think, oh, well, this is better. I know when I was I'll make a confession actually. When I was a student at Bourgeois economics, I was a rampant Keynesian. I was a rampant Keynesian. I'll vouch for the fact that many of the people in this room who have ever studied Bourgeois economics have become rampant Keynesians, because for it's more interesting. You haven't got all rubbish about marginal cost curves, demand and supply and all that, at least you be talking about something which has some relationship to a real world. Secondly, it seems relatively radical. It's about, Keynes didn't like unemployment. He wanted to do things to make the world a better place. He wanted to reform the system in all sorts of ways. And you think, well, good, and also it's very plausible. It's, the models you find in the economics textbooks are very, very plausible. I had real problem with Keynesianism. No longer. All right, now. However, it's important to say that Keynesianism in the textbooks, many Keynesians, rested on this peculiar sort of really rested on a foundation which remained what it had inherited from the marginalist tradition. So there's this peculiar combination in text, isn't there? You've got this world of perfect competition, all these little firms competing one against each other. This leads to wonderful results. Everybody's better off because of a wonderful process of competition and profit making and so forth. It's combined with the Keynesian remark, the basic Keynesian thesis that the market is unstable and therefore you need governments to come in and intervene. And the two really just sort of don't hold together. The two things don't fit together, and that's critical to the argument I'm going to develop. The other thing is that if you look at the key Keynesian concepts, they are apparently they're aggregated. They are like collective concepts. They don't seem to be individualistic. He talks about investment and consumption and so forth, which are important things. And one of his great insights, I think, was the critical role that investment plays in a capitalist society. Keynesianism was a response to the fact that the whole process of profit making had broken down in the 1930s, that investment wasn't happening, that this was the key to the crisis of the 1930s, and that therefore states needed to intervene to get investment going again, either investing themselves, governments actually taking over industries. And Keynes was willing to go a great deal further than many people realise, actually, in terms of state planning and state intervention, if it was necessary, especially in the time of the Second World War. Keynes was in many ways the prophet of state capitalism. Okay. Nevertheless, if you look at the roots of many of these concepts, you find, for example, let's just take one, the notion of consumption. You talk about actually consumption and savings, actually, which are two sides of the same coin. These are not class concepts. They are not. He doesn't talk about working class consumption and ruling class consumption. It's anybody's consumption. He doesn't talk about, ruling class savings. He doesn't actually talk about the fact that actually most savings in a capitalist society actually are generated out of what is called savings is really actually what comes out of profits, which in turn comes out of surplus value, which in turn is created by workers. None of that is there. And indeed, when he talks about investment and why capitalists don't invest, you find him retreating into rank sort of like psychologism. Again, he talks about the problems of pessimism, pessimistic expectations. He doesn't have a theory of the tendency of the right problem to fall, is really what I'm saying, actually. Maybe you wouldn't expect that. But if you look at it, it's sort of like the whole argument, suddenly sort of like falters. If you look through that incredibly difficult, rather confused, great work of his, you find that he suddenly starts retreating. He says, why don't they invest? It's because they're pissed off. They're pessimistic, These capitalists, they've got this pessimistic vision of the future, that things aren't going to go very well, and therefore they don't invest. Now, there's an element. The truth in that is true. Capitalists today have a very pessimistic appraisal of the future, in the sense that they are not willing to invest in building new factories because they are not sure that they are going to make a big enough profit in the future to satisfy them. Now, there's an element of truth in it, but of course, if it's just a matter of pessimism, then why, all you need really to do is sort of go on and cheer this capitalist up somehow, it's all right, What we'll do is we'll spend a lot of money, we'll give you a lot of contracts in defence sectors or building hospitals or roads or whatever it might be, and we'll basically tell the government will announce that everything is going to be fine for the next 10 years, the economy will go on expanding, and this in itself will encourage the capitalists to invest and everything will be lovely in the garden. Finally, if we're to understand Keynesism, we have to understand it as something which really focuses very much on the financial system as a source of problems. This again is difficult to see in the textbooks because you get all this elaborate stuff about liquidity preference and rates of interest or whatever. I'll just throw these things out for those people who know about these things. I'm sorry, I know I've got a split audience here. But anyway, anybody who's done the liquidity preference curve and all that stuff about interest rates and whatever, what's going on there is Keynes saying that financial markets are not working properly and these are the sources of the problem. Actually, very much tying in what Jim Kincaid was just talking about in the last talk, or whatever. In that sense, actually you can learn from Keynes. You can learn from his observations at a superficial level of what was wrong with the financial system. Because what underlay it was his reformism, his liberalism, his desire to save capitalism from the speculators, from the rentier element, from the people who were, as it were, not treating it the way it should be. They weren't actually, using these profits properly to invest in whatever. This, by the way, did not stop Keynes himself being a speculator. Keynes actually made a fortune for himself, as you say, in the stock market. Actually, did rather better, I suspect, than most, in fact, almost all economists would have done today. So you've got a reformism there, which is very influential in the Labour Party tradition and so forth, still persists in all the problems of the financial system, finance, capital, whatever. Control that, regulate that, and that will help regulate the system. Okay. Now, two elements, therefore, in this synthesis that two elements in this synthesis fall apart in the 1970s. Fall apart for very obvious reasons. I don't have a lot of time. I can go into sort of like the failures of Keynesism or whatever. What you have, nor do I want to give an explanation of why it seemed to work in the 50s and 60s. We've got that in our tradition very clear. The role of the Second World War, permanent arms spending, role of the state generally, and the limitations to that, and the re-emergence of a crisis of profitability in the late 1960s, early 1970s. I don't want to go over that at all. Combined, however, with something new. And something new actually did flow out of Keynesianism. And something new was chronic inflation, or this thing called stagflation. And here, if you like, the monetarists actually had a point to make. And the point, very simple point they had to make was that the government, and this actually didn't really happen until the late 1960s when it started to slow down, Keynesian response to a crisis, to a slump, is to crudely put, the state to spend more money, to pump more money into the system, increase the level of demand. Firms will respond to this by increasing output, investing in new factories and so forth. In the early 1970s, right through actually up to the present, but especially in the early 1970s, it wasn't happening like that. Governments could, as it were, pump money into the system, but companies were responding to this not by increasing output, but increasingly by pushing up their prices, inflation. And that went all hand in hand with all sorts of things about pushing money into the speculative markets or whatever. Now, and at the root of the problem there lay a growing crisis of profitability. So that instead of, basically, when you find your demand going up, instead of actually saying, right, we'll build a new factory to produce more goods, what you do is you simply increase your prices. And that's a self-accelerating thing. The whole process of, it leads to debt, people go to debt, borrow more money, the whole thing actually gets really out of hand. The trouble is that they find the system, and governments continue to find this problem a dilemma, which actually was summed up by, really the dilemma of stagflation was, if they kept pumping money in to try and keep up the level of demand, keep down unemployment, state intervening, it didn't really, unemployment seemed to still be going up, but it led to faster and faster inflation. On the other hand, if they tried to deal with inflation, if, for example, they tried to cut back on the pumping money into the system, if they tried to cut back, if the central bank as well tried to cut back on lending to the banking system, then you had a financial crisis and you had the danger of an appalling crash in the system, because the whole system had become so bloated in terms of, again, this is what Jim was talking about earlier in some ways, so bloated in terms of growth of inflation, money, debts or whatever. If the state sort of like squeezed, it was a very, very dangerous operation because the system was so fragile, because of profitability problems and so on. Now, Keynesianism really fell apart in the face of this as a guide to practice as far as government. That's really what the significance of Keynesianism, as a guide to practice, began to fall apart. This was reflected in the world of economists in the return of monetarism. The return of a monetarism which actually rested on really all the old neoclassical, all the old marginalist stuff at its root, and basically rested on the idea, a completely absurd idea, that the market system is a stable system, that capitalism is fundamentally a stable system as long as it's left alone. You know, laissez-faire, leave it alone, let the prices adjust, go up and down, whatever, stable. And it's only the form of governments that make it go wrong. A completely ludicrous idea that Keynes has wiped out. And yet they had something. The monetarists, and we have to recognise this, had a logic to them. And this is really what I want to stress in a way that we have to understand. We have to understand the paradox. We have to understand that this very ludicrous theory, with all sorts of ridiculous theoretical assumptions and so forth, nevertheless had a logic to it in terms of the needs of the ruling class. And what were the needs of the ruling class in response to the crisis? One looks at it just in terms of Britain, one has, it becomes very obvious at the time of the Labour government, of 1974-1980. This is really where, you know, it's a very famous speech, which unfortunately I bought the wrong book today, and I haven't got it. It's James Callaghan's famous speech in 1976, the Labour Party conference, I can't quite remember it. It goes something like this. It says, "We used to believe that you could get out of a slump by spending money, blah, blah, blah. Trouble is, if that worked at all in the past, it doesn't work anymore. You can't do it, comrades, hard luck. And anyway, we're get to the IMF and we've got to cut public spending, we've got to have a social contract, we've got to cut wages, we've got to do all the things that really sort of like the monetarist economists are saying were necessary." With an important difference, however, from what was later to come in terms of reliance on the trade union bureaucracy in a way, and on social contract, incomes policies if you like, which of course is where Keynesians got to as well. Keynesians actually had actually got to a point where they also were really saying we've got to hold down wages. Except what they wanted to do was to say, what they wanted to argue was, it's no good doing it by the monetarist methods, that will lead to massive unemployment, that is too risky, it's politically too destabilising. What we have to do is use an incomes policy to hold down wages. So really both Keynesians and monetarists were really after the same thing. Labour Party and Tory Party after the same thing. It all fits together in that sense, even though they're resting on very different traditions. Now, the logic of monetarism, therefore, rested on two things, I think. One is the crisis of profitability. We actually find, peculiarly enough, in people like Samuel Britton writing in the Financial Times, a clearer understanding that what British capitalism faces is a crisis of profitability than we do in the writings of many Keynesian economists. Samuel Britton, the great monetarist, arch Tory or whatever, has a clearer understanding of the significance of profit. He doesn't have a Marxist analysis of profit, he has a clearer understanding of the significance of profit for the system than the Keynesians do. And, secondly, a consciousness of the problems of international competition. The growing problems facing Britain and indeed any other, the pressures of international competition demanding that you basically cut costs of production within your own economy, national economy, to make yourself more competitive on the world market. Be like, the model shifts from that of welfare, the welfare state or whatever, Sweden or blah blah blah. The model suddenly becomes Singapore or South Korea or even the United States of America with its successful union bashing and low level of state spending, except of course in the arms sector. And yet there is a problem. The logic of it actually was, interestingly enough, described by one of the great Keynesian critics of the monetarists, a man called Lord Caldor, an advisor to the 1964-1970 Labour government, and so on and so forth. In some ways quite a sharp little character, actually. What he does is, he makes this statement, he made it in the House of Lords, believe it or not. He says, the Tories, blah 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 blah. The Tory government has managed to create a pool, or a reserve army, as Marx would have called it, of 3 million unemployed. And but for the fact that British Labour was not closed down, I'll come back to that in a minute, as looked like happening, a lame duck on Keith Joseph's definition if ever there was one, pointing to the contradiction, as it were, in the Tory policy, the figure would soon have risen to 4 million. He goes on. There is no use blinking at the fact that in terms of the power of masters over men, the existence of 3 million unemployed makes a vast difference. One has only to scan the statistics of absenteeism, the number of days lost through strikes and the size of wage settlements, both absolutely and relatively to the increase in the cost of living, to realise that the British working classes have been thoroughly cowed and frightened. This, of course, was before the miners' strike. But, we obviously know, people are here, I presume, will be clear about, the truth in what he's clearly saying there. The trade unions are demoralised and a climate of fear dominates the land. They go talks about the defeat of a near unanimous strike recommendation for the 350 shop stewards of British Labour only a week ago. This sort of stuff is actually worth reading. This is a sort of bourgeois economics which is worth reading. See? The Sam Brittons in the Financial Times, Lord Caldor speaking in the House of Lords. They're not writing textbooks with elaborate sort of models justifying, why capitalism is a wonderful system. They're talking about the problems faced by the British working class. He goes on, Mrs. Thatcher is our first Marxist Prime Minister, she says. None but the Marxists could speak so contemptuously of consensus politics. And here, of course, we have the sudden expose of where Caldor himself is at. Yeah? He compares Thatcher with Lenin. Blah, 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 blah. Then he goes, perhaps she needs reminding that there was never a more far-reaching consensus in Britain that attained by the wartime coalition government of Winston Churchill. Which, of course, actually is very interesting, because that's precisely what Pym and Gilmore and Tory Wets have thrown at Thatcher, yes. And indeed what Labour, Michael Foot, also goes right back, the glorious heyday of the Second World War, millions of people were dying and whatever, but, the government had it all under control, and it was actually doing hot to the United States of America, but that's neither here nor there. That's where Caldor is at, consensus politics, and actually, of course, all that tradition, the left Keynesians, as they're called, or left Keynesians, actually, what distinguishes them is their belief that Marxist markets, capitalism is unstable, but what you want is more state regulation, incomes policies, and the whole, really going back to the era of state capitalism, of the 1940s in Britain, when the state had everything under control. Exchange controls, import controls, the works. Now, but it can't work because of the international integration of the system. Because of the pressures of international competitiveness, because of the crisis of profitability, all those arguments make that whole tradition utterly bankrupt. And they can't do it, you see. I mean, Jim, again, spelled it out very well in his previous talk, about, which is why, the absurdity of the idea that you can somehow regulate the movements of capital or finance from one country to another, whatever. However, we also have to say that monetarists can't do it either, and that monetarism has had, if you like, an even briefer heyday, life in the limelight, the spotlight, than the Keynesians had. The Keynesians had, I suppose, 30-odd years of unrestricted... Now, I'm going to finish on this point, actually. The monetarists are themselves now in a state of acute disarray. There are so many varieties of monetarism now, you can't count them. I mean, here's what I was at university, there was one, now you have the rational expectations monetarists and the classical monetarists and the soft monetarists and the whatever, That is a response to the fact that quite clearly monetarism has failed in Britain, and indeed is failing globally. And there's a contradiction here which I just want to really spell out, because I think it's very important. The first thing, of course, is the point about British Labour. They haven't been prepared to risk really carrying the strategy through. And the riskiness is precisely what the Keynesians pointed out, that if you really squeeze the economy, if you cut off lending money to banks or to companies or whatever, which are in trouble or in debt, if you cut back on state spending, then the danger, of course, is the whole system comes completely crashing down. You don't have a slump of 3 million, you have a slump of 6 million. So they haven't been prepared to do that. The other problem they face, of course, is the class struggle. It's the ongoing resistance of the British Labour movement for all its enormous weaknesses, its economic reforms, all things that are spelled out in the recent articles in the International Socialist Journal. You nevertheless, it's a guerrilla struggle they are waging, and every time, as it were, it's like the First World War, isn't it? Every time they break through a trench, they send their forces in, they send the police in or whatever it may, they break through a trench, they find themselves coming up against another trench, It's sort of like, it's that sort of problem they face. They can't make the breakthrough. Contradiction, which is a global contradiction. The pressures of the crisis demand that they cut wages in Britain, that they cut public spending, they do all those things. They increase the rate of exploitation. Monetarism has a distorted recognition of that necessity at the heart of it. That's why all the stuff about the money supply is there. But look at the stuff about supply-side economics. Look at the later stuff, the stuff about getting rid of the wage councils, about really, what they'd like to do is get rid of social security benefits, get rid of the unions, whatever. That's the logic of their programme, is to get rid of all of that. Because social security benefits means that people on the dole don't go hammering on the doors of the factory, demanding to go to work, they can stay on the dole. Terrible, Leads to idleness, scroungers or whatever in the daily, the Telegraph version of it. But, trade unions, well, know all that stuff. But okay, let's suppose they succeed. The problem is that they're all doing it, isn't they? In every government, every major government in the industrial world, even the reformist, not even the reformist ones, especially the reformist ones, if you look at Spain or France or whatever, what's going on now, are trying to do the same thing. Now, in theory, if one of them could do it, they could gain a competitive edge on world markets. If one country can cut its cost of production, cut wages or whatever, they can gain a competitive edge on world markets, increase sales of exports or whatever, and that might lead to a fall in unemployment eventually, blah blah blah. Yeah. The trouble is, if they all do it, then what you've got is, in other words, if everybody's a monetarist, if all the governments have suddenly become monetarists, which of course they haven't. I mean, the United States government hasn't become monetarist in that sense. But if they all go in for that sort of cutting of spending, then the effect is to depress the level of world economic activity, to risk sending the whole global system spiralling down into another even deeper slump or whatever. So the dilemma they face remains, and so you get the reappearance of Keynesianism. It's quite astonishing. You get monetarism. Nigel Harris gave a talk on Friday night, let's finish on this, which was a wonderful talk, making some very, very correct points about the swing to the right in the system, the shift to monetarism, privatisation or whatever, we also have to say that is in a way is already out of date, at least as far as the advanced industrial countries are concerned. We now get, all this, Switzerland British ruling class talking about reflation, spending more money. How they do it, of course, is, involves all sorts of problems. There is no way out for them. And the fact that there is no way out of them is actually reflected in the bankruptcy of bourgeois economics. Okay. It doesn't work, it